Good evening and welcome to our annual prestigious Thomas Sutton Lecture here at the Charterhouse. I have to say it's a delight to see so many familiar names. I'd really like to welcome our Charterhouse brothers, staff, governors, friends of the Charterhouse, neighbours, and everyone else who's joining us here this evening. My name is Anne Kenrick. I'm the master here at the Charterhouse, and I'm delighted you've joined us, albeit virtually this evening, to hear award-winning eminent architect Eric Parry, who will be talking about boundaries in the context of the Charterhouse, and also talking about his thinking behind the major Revealing the Charterhouse project. As you can see, this evening, I'm speaking to you from our gloriously beautified great chamber. And of course, it is a great sorrow to me that I'm not welcoming you here in person. It feels rather echoey here, but I'm sure if you were all here with a glass of wine in your hand, it would be so much better. And we really genuinely do look forward to welcoming you back to the site. So for any of you who are new to the Charterhouse, let me just say a couple of words. The Charterhouse is a historic 7-acre site located between the Barbican and Farringdon on the edge of the City of London. The site dates back to 1348 and has been a Carthusian monastery, a great Tudor mansion. This very room was visited by Queen Elizabeth I a week before her coronation. Then a school for boys founded by Thomas Sutton, and an almshouse, which it remains to this day, providing accommodation for 40 men and women. Normally, we would be open to the public, welcoming you all to visits, tours, events, and offering stunning rooms such as this one to hire for all manner of events. But obviously, the health and well-being of some of our older and more vulnerable residents means that we have to remain closed for the time being, as the health is our priority. So we are hoping and planning to reopen in the spring towards the end of March, and we very much look forward to welcoming you then into our gardens and our wonderful buildings. But in the meantime, we are presenting a variety of online opportunities to enjoy the Charterhouse and learn something about many of the things that we're passionate about: the heritage, arts, gardens, well-being, and so much more. And I'd like to thank you genuinely for your donations in attending this event. We are extremely grateful because the charity is having many challenges throughout this difficult period, with our usual income from the public completely halted. Previous eminent speakers who have given the Thomas Sutton Lecture include Professor Vincent Gillespie, my husband Sir Mark Warby, and last year we had Tracy Borman. And for the first time, the lecture was sponsored by our neighbours and long-term supporters, Diploma PLC. Diploma is an international group of businesses supplying specialised technical products and services and operating globally in 3 sectors: life sciences, seals, and controls. And I'd like to thank them for again sponsoring the lecture this year. And I'd like to hand over to Barbara Gibbs, the Chief Financial Officer of Diploma, for a few words before I introduce our speaker. Barbara. I think this is frustrating, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Barbara to say a few words at the end of the lecture, because I fear there must be a technical problem, because it didn't look like she was on mute, but certainly I couldn't hear what she had to say. So Barbara, we'll hear from you at the end of the lecture, if that's okay. So I'd like to just go on to say how delighted I am that our lecture this year is going to be presented by our old friend, Eric Parry. Eric and his company, Eric Parry Architects, is known very well to most of you. And he and his company have been behind many notable projects around London, with an especially strong track record in developing heritage and cultural sites, such as the Leather Sellers Hall and St Martin's in the Fields in Trafalgar Square, which is glorious. Eric Parry Architects was commissioned to take on the major project of opening the Charterhouse to the public, which happened in 2017, just as I joined the Charterhouse. And this was the first time in over 400 years that it was being opened, and a whole new entrance was created together with a museum and learning centre. So today he joins us to share the inspirations and ideas behind welcoming and engaging the public with this ancient, previously hidden site. Thank you, Eric. I'll hand over to you now.
Thank you, Master Anne. That's marvelous, and I hope everyone can see my screen. So let's just check that that's the case. I hope that it's clear. So I'm assuming so. So I'm honoured to be giving this lecture this evening, and excuse me if I deviate in various ways, but in terms of the questions of revealing, there is a lot to do with boundaries and changes and time, and then of course place and material. And I begin really by thinking about the power of foundation, and I suppose that there is nowhere where that is more evident in terms of what succeeded than the foundation of Rome and Romulus's tomb, the so-called Lapis Niger, in the Forum, so close to the heart of the Senate, the Curia, and so forth. And it inspires a thought about foundation being a combination of augury, of deliberation, of chance, of the flight of birds, of divining livers, as has been, a universal trait, and at the same time the science of the surveyor, which is absolutely at the heart of Rome, and the way in which it created order in the world. In the same way, when we undertook the Revealing the Charterhouse project, it revealed, an incredible richness. So it was a competition, and although I had some idea, its riches and history came to light over time, and this is a shot. A photograph looking into the left-hand corner of this image, the processional way. It's like a causeway that we created to allow the public into the Charterhouse for the first time, really, since its foundation. And as I'll come to show a little later on through some of the complexities, as you pass, you'll see a small sign on access with a new tomb covering, and beyond that another placement of the altar, of an ancient altar. So you'll hopefully see my cursor as well. So this is the new covering to a tomb that was excavated in 1947 in the first archaeological explorations post-war of the Charterhouse, to reveal the remains of Sir Walter Manny, who was buried with a lead bulla of Clement VI, his dates as Pope being 1342 to 52, and it gave a sort of resonance to that sense of where the Charterhouse began, as we'll come to see. So, in fact, what we're looking at here is the outline of the old Carthusian monastery church, that preceded the monastery as a prayer chapel in a plague burial. That is really what Charterhouse Square now represents. So this very important place had lost almost all its presence. Intriguingly, what was the chapter house, the meeting house of the monastery, is left in the chapel of what became the school of the Charterhouse, and now the chapel, the church of the Charterhouses exists. But you will see just here this little peephole in the wall, which is part of the treasury that lies above the entrance passage into the church, from which a monk could view the altar and therefore the liturgical events held in the chapel. In any case, when the Charterhouse became a mansion, this chapel and the monks' cells were demolished, and we will come to that. But I wanted to start with, actually, in that sense that foundation is about divination and surveying, about pragmatics and poetics, with a note about the importance of plumbing. And this image that was part of two leaves of a great psalter of Edwine, is actually a remarkably accurate description of the waterworks surrounding Christ Church, Canterbury. And it shows, it's a very sophisticated drawing. It shows water as clean, coming from a well and stored in a cistern and distributed in blue, and then the drains in brown as they move around the site. So this cistern is a sort of key to the way in which a monastic foundation, a church, great church, could exist, and could exist in an orderly fashion, with lots of other areas of water, so a fish pond and so on, cleaning. And it is a remarkable survivor because it is the only image that we have, I think it's fair to say, of the Norman Christ Church at Canterbury as a building which Thomas à Becket would have known. And we are at a point where his murder is now 850 years old, as it were, in 1170, and 800 years since the translation of his relics. So it's a remarkable document. And actually, you can see how that image, how accurate it is in terms of its placement with a surveyed plan of the great church, and the enlargements that happened to create a palimpsest of English architecture as well, that is illustrated here. And one of the other things about that beautiful drawing of waterworks, which we'll come to in terms of a resonance with the Charterhouse, is also the nave that is part and parcel of this transformation in terms of architectural style to the perpendicular Gothic. Is a late masterpiece in the life of a great architect, great surveyor, architect, Henry Yeaveley, whose life spanned a long time, 1320 to 1400. So the last years, from 1377 to 1400, he spent working on this wonderful work that has a fantastic rigor and these soaring shafts and the vaulting, seen in perspective with light cutting across them, are an absolute joy. It's a remarkable piece of work. And that purity of geometry is something that's picked up by another of his works. Some years earlier, he was mostly involved in London, but also at Windsor, part of the King's works. And you can just see here in this plan of London, aerial view, of the religious institutions that make up this northwards trajectory from the river to this square here, which is really a very perfect geometry. It is the Charterhouse, and it is the Charterhouse square outside the plague burial area, and the chapel that is now no longer. But it's striking that outside the city walls it lies most clearly. So we have, and it's completely astonishing, a number of wonderful descriptions of the waterworks for the Charterhouse as well. So in more detail than that earlier drawing, which is dated, I think, to around about 1165. So this plan is mid-15th century and it also shows in an extraordinary way, a detailed way, the way water came into the site from Clerkenwell, the way it was housed in this cistern and then distributed to the cardinal points to serve the monastic houses, which we'll come to describe in a little more detail. It has details to do with particular parts, with stopcocks and other important parts, and it shows the trajectory of water through critical parts of the establishment to the lay brothers' areas just without the curtilage of the interior, and then onwards to at least 2 public houses and other facilities in the vicinity. So I think the other thing that's really interesting here, like the description of Christ Church at Canterbury, is the description of the church as part of the monastery. It's been as part of the Survey of London monograph on the Charterhouse, which is in its own right a very special document and rare to have not an area but a very particular place described in such detail wonderfully. Here is the explanation of that drawing in its original form, with the presence of the chapter house, the waterworks, and the architecture even of the church, with the open space beyond. So it's a most evocative document, because it also shows the cell numbers or letters, the letters to the cells, and it shows this indent, which is very characteristic of the Carthusian order, which I'll come to describe in a little more detail. But before I do so, just going back to the issues of surveying and to the early views, aerial views of London. This is a map that's known erroneously as the Agas map. It's actually based on some earlier copper plates produced by German merchants as a description of a burgeoning London. This one dates to the mid-16th century. It's rather wonderful. Obviously, it's very familiar actually when you start to look at it in detail. Obviously, London Bridge, to the right, Aldgate, Chaucer's residence for many years. Here, the Charterhouse, which is actually named as such, with the church or the chapel at this point in that space. Very, very clear in the copper plate. Actually, St. Paul still has a spire here. It's gone, but you then see the processional way of Fleet Street running westwards, and the Fleet River coming through here. And here, Whitefriars. So one of those religious orders that were part of the map that I showed earlier. And that, in its own right, has gone through many transformations. Just to the left of this is the temple. So in its ancient form as a center of legal study, pursuits, and then palaces that used to be part of the Strand. And that then is another form of description of boundary, moving beyond that, which is the wonderfully detailed axonometric presentation of buildings. Suddenly here, this is Wenceslas Holler's plan and view of 1666. So actually created only 11 weeks after the Great Fire, but it's as it's titled, an exact survey of the streets, lanes, and churches contained within the ruins of the City of London. It shows very clearly the way in which the fire expanded and then was finally extinguished, and is a remarkable document in its own right, with the streets that were to remain so clearly. It was actually, it's interesting, as a piece of surveying, he'd been working in London for many years by this point, but here at this point it was actually considered to be an outdated method of description by the new scientific spirit. And of course, right after the fire, all those great plans were produced within days by Wren and Hooke and Evelyn and others, in a very rational way. But this describes the complexity of the city and the city passages and streets. And this is actually just an image of where we are now, metamorphosis. A site, this is Fleet Street, that part of that great processional way, St. Paul's, the Old Bailey, St. Bride's, and behind it, the growth of the eastern cluster, as it's known, with the valley that's carefully defined to allow the lantern and cupola of St. Paul's to remain intact on the horizon, and a scheme currently we're working on for a new law courts, police headquarters, and a third building on the site, which will create a sort of a quarter of law and order, a new quarter of law and order in the city. And I just wanted to digress again, but just to think about that which is beyond the physical evidence in terms of endurance, to the question of place names. So actually this is the result of a fairly short walk between these places, just south of the Danish border, near a inland cutting from the Baltic called the Schlei. And it is on what's known in German as the Wikinger Weg, the way the Vikings came between the Baltic and the North Sea. And you have these names: Norby, Rieserby, Sunderby, Gammelby, Barkelsby, And it is remarkable if you take the latitude and cross to Lincolnshire, where you find names that are a direct echo of Grimsby, Grimoldsby, Reby, Spilsby, Swaby, Tealby, and so forth. It is remarkable how that connection culturally that has been eroded and developed in so many ways still is so clear in the naming of places. And I wanted again just to think about the question of surveying, thinking of the aftermath of the fire, the description of places as a memory of them, as a description of them, which is the way that images like the Agas and Holler plans and views of London were used, to another description of landscape. In this case, this is a tribal map of Fars province in Iran, with which I got involved in the mid-70s. So spent a year looking at nomadic settlement and trying to understand principles and actually the context in which these groups, these great tribal groups, particularly the Kashkai and a subset called the Darashuri, who were particularly famous for their horse breeding. But it's a very interesting echo of the ancient nomadic routes that occur between the highlands and the lowlands seasonally in order to feed herds principally. And just on the right, the incredible terrain that is part and parcel of that mapping. So one needs to overlay these territories of influence by parts of the tribal community on the mountainous and quite arid territories, but nonetheless between low and highlands. And these are just images from that work. I should say that that plan was produced by an anthropologist, a social anthropologist called David Marsden, with whom we were in touch and helping by making surveys, two of us, of the settlement of the Darashuri in these incredible landscapes. So that's not to go into detail, but it is a thought about boundaries that are bound up in a very different way of mapping. Back in the 20s, filmmakers made a remarkable film, I think, ethnographically speaking, in terms of the study of tribal culture, called Grass: A Nation's Battle for Life. It was made by Marion Cooper and Ernst Schoensack, who went on, in fact, to make King Kong in 1933. But what is remarkable is the sense of that travel between lowlands and highlands for herds in really treacherous moments between the floodwaters from the snows, getting across, having to leave older members of the tribe on one side as those who are capable of making the passage could. And indeed, to this idea of a ownership or a territory of influence in landscape that is part of the Middle East here, with this tribal map of Arabia. Back in the 30s, in fact. What is so fascinating is also what happens when there's a clash, and that's the case here with the dotted lines that you can see, for instance, running across here, that are the result of coming together in a place called Ukwer, a protocol of 1922 created really by the League of Nations in order to define boundaries in order to extract oil. So cutting across the understanding of boundary in landscape to create, particularly around this point, two neutral zones, which were all to do with Bedouin and the accommodation of that in a territory that up to that point was obviously ruled by nomadic law. And that can be set against another surveying episode, a heroic one, the Commissioner's Plan for Manhattan of 1811. So this is a stretch of territory about 7 miles or so, created by Robert Morris, one of the founding fathers, and as an instruction, and carried out by John Randall, a surveyor. And the plan was actually following Philadelphia, was to create a grid of 12 avenues, each of which would be 100 foot wide, so these, and crossed by streets, of which there would be 155. So they're half the width. And you can see how it's laid over that topography. So the grid simply runs across it with some disruption. So the end of Greenwich Village and so on was left intact, as was a road called Bloomingdale that runs across the grid that becomes Broadway. And it is clearly actually, and was, an echo of an admiration for Roman colonization. They created then by that the consequence of those grids was to create blocks between the streets and the avenues that were 300 meters long by 80 meters wide. And 3 of those were bought, well, they were ceded to Columbia College as it was, and then bought by Rockefeller. And just talking about heroic transformations, this is what succeeded those 3 blocks. The Rockefeller Center, which I think is an absolute masterpiece of urban design, followed on by many other tall buildings, and obviously at the same time of the great classics that preceded them. But it is a feat of much engineering and management and great architecture that gives rise to, for instance, the width of the stage at Radio City and the Rockettes that are part of that, and much else. There's a huge wealth on the street, NBC News and so on, that makes up actually what has become the sort of navel of New York in urban terms, along with the greening of Central Park, which is another story. But to return to the main thrust of this evening, the revealing the Charterhouse and its setting. So on the left is an aerial image of the Charterhouse, and you can just see the outline of what was the inner precinct, the cloistered central space with the cistern and the 4 rivers that emanated from it to the background of the monks' cells. And the Carthusians were, or are, I should say, a silent order. You can get a very good idea of that in a film called Into the Great Silence. And we can come back to that, but this is sort of typical, and it's about the scale of the Charterhouse in London. This is the Certosa in Pavia, and it's the Italian Certosa for the Carthusian order, set outside the town, absolutely idealized world, with each of the monks having a working space on the ground, an old small private art shrine and a bedroom above it, and then a garden for contemplation. And very importantly, the separation of the lay brothers who delivered the food, the needs, through a secreted entrance that would mean that the lay and the monks didn't come into visual contact. So that is, in a way, about the scale as well. A large, obviously, the intactness of the lay buildings, the lay brothers buildings, and then the centrality of the church. And this goes back to the mother monastery. What we're seeing here is essentially late 17th century buildings, but the Grande Chartreuse, as it's known, north of Grenoble, was established in 1084 around a chateau which was given by Saint Hugh to the hermit Saint Bruno, the founder of the order. And again, the same structuring is evident in this, with the lay brothers further down the valley. It's a quite awe-inspiring silence in terms of its approach as well. The story of the Charterhouse is like that of Christchurch. It is one also of tragedy, and clearly the London Charterhouse, which is slightly unusual in terms of its proximity to the city, another story within that, was a key centre of resistance to Henry's Reformation and became an absolute cause célèbre in Europe in terms of the destruction of it and the martyrdom of many of the monks. So 17 who died and several who were taken to Tyburn from the Tower of London, looked on by Thomas More and his daughter. And Thomas More had spent several years very closely involved with the Charterhouse itself. The monastery was acquired by Sir Edward North in 1545, and over nine years was transformed, partly by destruction. He took down two vital parts, the chapel and the cells. And then following that period, it was bought by Thomas Howard, the fourth Duke of Norfolk, who got embroiled and beheaded in after the Ridolfi plot. And this great then Tudor mansion becomes a very important place for the monarchy, so that it is where Elizabeth I arrives before she takes up the throne and has a discourse with the City of London in 1558. And then after her death, James I also comes here and bestows a lot of knighthoods after Elizabeth's death on the 24th of March 1603. The Revealing the Charterhouse project then picked up beyond that the story from the early 17th century, which was the bequest from Thomas Sutton, the named sponsor, so to speak, of this lecture, who died in December 1611, but who had bought the great property in May and obtained letters patent to establish the almshouse and the school. In the 19th century, the school leaves, and what is intact is completely remarkable and a wonderful palimpsest of architectural and social history. So that there are some elements like Washhouse Court, which are very, very much intact as 16th century, and lots of earlier fabric, including some of the portals to the old cells of the monks. Our interventions were then to create, for the first time, a sense of welcome. So the idea that from the square we could make an entrance that was clear and that would introduce the acreage that you don't see and can't see, even if you are on a tour, because much is still part of the brothers' territory of internal gardens. And so there is a consequence of that, to try and make that evident. There was a need to create a fencing, but also a portal and a passage that would bring you into a territory which, you know, part of the transformation was the fire that destroyed so much fabric in the Second World War, which allowed us to take what was a shell that had been repurchased, repositioned as a series of brothers' bedrooms along this flank by Seeley and Paget after the Second World War. But as that was reinstated fabric, we were able to create the larger room we needed to create for education purposes. So the Charterhouse entered a partnership with the Museum of London as part of the Revealing project, to enable school children and others to be able to use a space, but particularly school children to be able to come in the morning, stay for several hours, have their lunch and leave in the early afternoon, principally. So the education room was part of our brief. As part of that, there was the need for cloakrooms and toilets and a new entry space at this point, and then the repurposing of a common room as a museum, and touching on the passage back to the church through what was the entrance to the chapter house of the monastery. At the same time, making evident the incredible importance of that original foundation church next to the plague pit, and then actually creating an access to this point, and in due course a garden that evokes the scale of the monastic cells. So that was the briefing for the project, and this was the state of that space, a kind of a fig tree, literally, that covered in its entirety the magic of the space beyond. And this was the rebuilt Seeley and Paget work after the war and the bombing. So this is the state, the condition before, as I said, with the brothers' bedrooms, the Wesley room, a small group of toilets, which we repositioned to enable that space jointly to become the new museum space. And this is the transformation with the idea of the knot garden, creating a sense of planting that echoes the body of the church with the altar and other parts. So one of the things in terms of our own surveying that we began with was realizing the incredible richness of portals that were part of the history of the site. And this just shows the incredible collection from the great archway under the Master's Lodge to the entrances to smaller spaces like Washhouse Court and so forth. We worked with Todd Longstaff Gowan to create a repurposing and a redefinition of the square, which actually up to this point had been rather well, it had been closed and not open to the public, open to a school on the other side of the square for certain times, but was singular in a path. And I think Todd's beautiful work was to create a planting around the edge, a kind of promenade that catches the orientation in the sun, and would give, from the new Crossrail station, which is now emerged, an entrance that would take you across the square to the entrance to the Revealing project. So the entrance went through many transformations. It started as a sort of baldaquin, and then went on to become what you see now through a transformation of a four-stemmed lantern. We had agreed that we would try and light the square with gas, and that a gas light would mark the entrance to the opened Charterhouse. So that's a before above and the after below. And this just shows the spaces as they were before. This is the bombed shell of the old mansion, in fact, principally, and the old corridor to the brothers' bedrooms, and then the transformation, looking at the many different configurations that the room could accommodate. And here it is, as before and as after, and the relocated wonderful plaster of Charity is now placed in the museum. The Wesley Room, and then the museum with one of the great vellums that describe the drainage, and indeed parts of the old cloistered walk. So here we are with that image. The long gallery, which was the point of distribution, it would have been perhaps timber originally, is part of the definition of the cloister, with the apertures in the wall to the cells. Here it is as was, and because it's been truncated through the 20th century, a dark mirrored element wall that would give a sense of the length that you see in those earlier descriptions, and to the threshold of the scheme, which is encapsulated in this in its final version, which early sketch just of the two legs, the wrought iron, a canopy element that is in a sort of position of genuflection. I always had the idea of a sort of white moon above and the gasolier element below, and then the gates that would be able to be closed, but at all times you would be able to see the casting of the scale of the space beyond. So this gave rise to the thinking about the materials as a crafted, very much crafted product made by a company in the Lake District, Chris Bramall, and here you see it being fabricated, and the sort of scaling actually, and the geometry, quite complex geometry. It has to take the pipe work for the gas, but it also has to be obviously very substantial in terms of its structure. And this is the model, so that whilst you come to the gate, you can see when the gates are closed or when they're open, enjoy the prospect of where you are and what you're seeing and the significance of it in relation to the rest of the Charterhouse. And here it is completed, and underneath it, a little homage also to the original plan of Henry Yaverley, a wonderful geometry with the 23 cells that make up its original formation as a monastic institution just outside the gates of London. Thank you very much.
Eric, thank you. That was absolutely glorious. I mean, I thought I knew everything there was to know about the Charterhouse and the Revealing project, but you've given us some fantastic insights there and put it in a really interesting global context, which I'm sure has given us a lot of food for thought. I'm going to give everyone the opportunity to ask some questions if they want to put anything in on chat, but and I've got some great feedback already from some of the guests, Eric. But what I'm going to try and do firstly, we had a technical challenge with Barbara earlier, but I'm going to see if I can hand over to you, Barbara, just to say a few words from Diploma. So fingers crossed, and over to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Anne. I hope people can hear me. Excellent. That's an improvement. Technology is certainly making all our lives a lot more interesting. So as CFO of Diploma, and Anne very kindly described at the start what we do, so I won't repeat. I am delighted that we've been able to continue with our support for the Thomas Sutton Lecture. And thank you very much, Eric, for such an interesting and insightful lecture. I walk past the Charterhouse almost every day, and I'm just delighted to know more about it, understand more about the context. That was really fascinating. And I just wanted to say that Charterhouse is so much more than just a building and gardens. It's a wonderful charity. It's a huge contributor to the local community. And it's just great to be able to support such a great cause. So thank you very much for this great lecture and for the opportunity.
Barbara, thank you so much. I'm delighted that you could join us virtually this evening and look forward to welcoming you to the great chamber in person before too long. Could I just ask, Eric, from my perspective, I know we're running out of time a bit, but I just wondered, what was the biggest challenge for you in the project here at the Charterhouse, would you say?
Well, I think the thing about architects, I'm absolutely not a historian. I get to know, the project I'm working on over time and end up, I hope, being quite close to it. So the biggest challenge, of course, was to be asked to compete and then have to get under the surface a little bit to make what are inevitably intuitive ideas either fall or live. It's that sort of continuous process of dialogue with you as client, getting to know the sort of culture of your organization, as it were, the culture of the institution, and then being able to try and create a spatial framework for it. And that obviously is open to, I always think that you've got to have a firm idea, a firm skeleton around which lots of changes can happen. So the great challenge, apart from the the mysteries that were revealed as we were able to be more intrusive in the building, were to do with getting to a point where people were happy with what one was proposing. And it's obviously such delicate matter, that I think you freeze if you know too much. You need to have a sort of inspired innocence to get anywhere.
Thank you. Well, you certainly succeeded immensely. Just one final question from me. Did you involve the brothers of the Charterhouse at all in this?
Very much. I mean, that was remarkable because the brothers know so much, and they wear their knowledge generally quite lightly. But consultation is so important, where we're dealing with it's not a museum, it's a living place. It's wonderfully, it's vibrant, and therefore actually one has to be very aware that those opinions really matter. So we had many consultations, and I think, you know, and in the end, a kind of agreement.
Interesting. And I've got a final question from someone in the audience. She says, or he says, sorry, a lot of this project was clearly about removing boundaries. What boundaries did you choose to leave intact in the project here, and how did you manage the presentation of those boundaries?
Yes, absolutely right. So, well, I have to say, first of all, we were guided. We're not, you know, we were absolutely guided by yourselves. So what we could and couldn't do. You know, it was absolutely clear that there were layers of possibility, of which, with the Museum of London and a great team there, the work of the museum, and you know, the exhibition, by the way, we did not do. So that is very much yourselves and the Museum of London. I should be very clear about that. We enabled the space to take that museum, that exhibition. But the idea that that the public can walk into the entrance, the reception, and are able to see the history of dwelling, really. It's a remarkably intense experience, from monastery, from silence to you know, lay brothers, to then great figures from the Tudor age, to the school and the brothers. It's amazing. It's an amazing history of dwelling in the city, and so that I think was a key. But the boundaries are layer upon layer, and I think the point was never to close everything. To give a hint, like the model does, for instance. So the first boundaries are the opening of the square with the landscape designers. The second, the railings and the capacity for the screen with its bon mots to be able to close. The third is the welcome, when those are open, and to be able to walk into that incredibly resonant passage, the causeway, and to have to halt with the importance of the sacred axis, and then on we go. So boundary upon boundary upon boundary.
Thank you. Well, certainly anyone who's with us virtually tonight and who hasn't physically been to the Charterhouse, I would encourage you very strongly to do so as soon as we do open. And I also wanted to just confirm that several people have asked whether a recording will be available, because we had such wonderful images, Eric, that some of us would like to look at those in more detail. So I'm delighted to say that we will be sending out a recording to everyone who has so kindly donated to be with us here this evening. So can I just say, Eric, thank you so much. I'm sure everyone enjoyed your lecture as much as I did. Thank you also to Diploma for not only providing sponsorship, but coming back and talking to us after Eric's lecture. Your sponsorship in these difficult times makes a massive difference to us, with a lot of our income dried up completely and the charity really suffering as a result. We do hope that you will join us for future lectures. We're enjoying this monthly program, and would ask you to, we will be sending out a link to the newsletter so you can hear all about what's going on. We've got a new online shop which is doing extremely well, as nobody can go to the shops. Do come and visit us and support the charity instead, do think about becoming a friend of the Charterhouse. I can see from the names here, we have many of our friends here. One of the benefits is free access to our lectures. So just visit the website if you're interested in that. I've had a wonderful evening tonight. I'm sure you all have too, but I'm now going to close this evening's proceedings. So thank you and good night. Thank you, Eric.